Thank you, Matt. Yeah, young superstar. I don't think so, but thank you. And thanks again for the invitation as well as for organising the event. Also like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, so the Turrbal and the Yagara people. As Matt said, my name is Samuli Haataja. I'm a legal academic at Griffith Law School. My research is around cybersecurity and public international law. And I guess related to the sort of theme of the international peace and security contributions we've had so far, my contribution will then look at this idea of responsible state behaviour in cyberspace and the Pact for the future. So looking at cybersecurity from an international law as well as international security perspective, and how current debates in that context fit in or align with what's in the Pact for the future. So as an overview, I just wanted to make some general remarks, first of all, about the Pact for the future, and then look at the specific actions relating to international peace and security, and I guess how they relate to cybersecurity. So generally, I mean, I think the Pact is welcome in its commitment to international law and multilateralism, and efforts to create a better world for future generations. So there's reiterating the SDGs, so the Sustainable Development Goals, cooperation around digital technologies, AI, and so on. Particularly in the current geopolitical climate, so Gaza, Ukraine, incoming Donald Trump version 2, so a lot of challenges, I guess, to these institutions. And like I said, I looked at the Pact mainly from the international peace and security perspective with a focus on my area of research around state-sponsored or state-supported cyber activities under international law. The final version of the Pact is quite interesting as concepts like AI or artificial intelligence occur almost 40 times. The reference to nuclear war or nuclear weapons, again, about a dozen references to that, whereas the idea of cyber only appears 3 times. So AI is clearly the buzzword, and the sort of reinvigorated threat of nuclear weapons, nuclear war is at the forefront. The Global Digital Compact, which I know we'll have a session later, mainly focused on digital technologies and their broader societal benefits in relation to SDGs, for instance. There is a cyber dimension to a lot of the actions that I'll speak about soon, but otherwise I'd say that cyber is missing from the Pact. And essentially, the draft version, or interestingly, the draft version does make reference to this idea of responsible state behaviour in cyberspace, but then the final version makes no reference to that or the existing developments, the work at the United Nations level looking at this idea. But I'd argue that this is really important as states are seeking to define and develop the boundaries of responsible state behaviour in cyberspace, including how international law applies in this context, and in doing so promote predictability, stability, and minimise the risk of escalation of conflict in this context. So looking at the text of the Pact a bit more, this is the first section on international peace and security. So it recognises how the global security landscape is changing and how we've seen violations of key provisions of the UN Charter. So for instance, the prohibition of the use of force, the unlawful invasion of Ukraine, and so on. So the Pact seeks to at least reaffirm this commitment to international law as well as the UN as an organisation. But otherwise, a lot of this text is fairly generic. Again, you'll see very similar text in many UN reports around international peace and security, for instance. The next paragraph that continues then notes the need to urgently address accumulating and diverse threats to international peace and security, and that's where they mention cyberspace in particular. So here at least they explicitly reference or recognise the diversity of threats we're facing and how malicious cyber activities can also contribute or constitute a threat or a dimension to threats to international peace and security. And this is really an area where there's been a lot of work occurring at the United Nations level for around 2 decades already. So there's been 2 parallel UN processes, the UN GGE, so the Group of Governmental Experts, and the OEWG, so the Open-Ended Working Group. Both are looking at essentially this idea of advancing responsible state behaviour in cyberspace. just briefly, the UNGG is this sort of closed door, 25 members meeting to discuss these issues, whereas the OEWG is a more recent development, more inclusive, more transparent, includes NGOs, civil society, etc., to look at similar issues. So they both have a mandate in terms of developing clarity around responsible state behaviour in cyberspace, including international law, capacity building measures, confidence building measures, and so on. There's also a discussion of a proposal for a so-called program of action, which would then see a combination of these processes into a more formalised permanent UN forum. But as part of these processes, states have then generally agreed on this very broad level that international law does apply to the activities in cyberspace, but there continues to be debate about how specifically it applies. And then to address this, states have been invited to provide what are called their national positions on how they consider international law to apply in cyberspace. And we have over 30 of these positions now. Just earlier this year, the African Union came out and published its sort of common position of how it regards international law to apply. And then just last week, so the European Union also published its common understanding of its member states on this topic. But from these positions, what you can see or what's emerging is that while states are starting to develop some consensus and some agreement in some areas, in other areas there's really a lot of uncertainty in the law and still debate about how it applies. For example, so if a state obtains unauthorized access to computer systems, networks in another state, does that violate international law on sovereignty, for instance, or is it a lawful form of cyber espionage? Or what if law enforcement disrupts the activities or networks of a criminal organization in another state without the government's consent? Again, does that sort of activity violate international law? And these are really live questions where the answer to those questions differs based on who you ask. So for instance, the European Union, many states from the global north, including Australia and New Zealand, would regard those sort of activities as lawful. Whereas then you have the global south, so African Union, for instance, some South American states that would see those as unlawful activities, essentially. So back to the Pact for the Future, while it recognises the importance of international law and threats to international peace and security in cyberspace, it ultimately doesn't really add any further clarity to these debates and these questions. Here I've just included a list of the actions under that international peace and security section, some of which we've already heard about today. As I mentioned earlier, cyber is really missing from these, but some of these actions do have a cyber dimension to it. Just to mention a few, so Action 23, a future free from terrorism. Here the UN condemns terrorism in all of its forms, and the Pact also provides a commitment to, quote, address the threat posed by the misuse of new and emerging technologies, including digital technologies and financial instruments for terrorist purposes. So it recognises the threat posed by the malicious misuse of these technologies and that this needs to be addressed. Action 24 in relation to organised crime. So again, recognise the threat posed by these actors to international peace and security. And this is where we get the second reference to cyber, so to speak, in the context of the new UN Convention on Cybercrime. So again, highlights that as a means through which international cooperation can be improved. Actions 25 and 26, which we just heard about, again, really important provisions and commitments, but largely existing or restatements of existing obligations and in relation to, I guess, more traditional weapons of mass destruction. But nothing here or elsewhere in the Pact, for instance, about the less visible so-called arms race around cyber weapons. So essentially states and other actors seeking to develop their cyber capabilities, and often this is through, let's say, hoarding undisclosed vulnerabilities in computer software. Famous examples that many of you probably heard about, the WannaCry and NotPetya incidents from 2017. So there you had, in one instance, North Korean developed ransomware infecting hundreds of thousands of computers around the world, including the UK National Health System or Service. NotPetya, in the same year, Russian-developed malware or ransomware affecting systems mainly in Ukraine, but it also spread around the world in what the US at the time described as the most devastating cyber attack in history. And underpinning both of those tools or cyber capabilities was NSA, so US National Security Agency, developed tools that had been stolen from the agency, leaked to the public, and then repurposed by those, I guess, other countries, adversaries, and used for malicious purposes. So this sort of ongoing, more invisible, perhaps arms race in the cyber context. Finally, I just wanted to speak about Action 27 a little bit more. So I've included that there, most parts of it. So here, the Pact at least recognises how technological change creates new risks and opportunities to international peace security, and importantly, the role of international law in addressing these risks. And when I got to this part, I thought, okay, this is where it'll at least mention cyber in some way, but no. So you can see from the list, they mention preventing the arms race in outer space, the ongoing debates around lethal autonomous weapon systems, bridging digital divides, and the broader risks of military applications of artificial intelligence. Again, all of these are important, and there is a cyber dimension that underpins them. So satellites, space assets, military AI systems, again, all of these can be potentially exploited by cyber means. But like I mentioned, the Pact makes no sort of reference to then these UN debates around how these technologies should be regulated. However, as I mentioned at the beginning, if we look at the zero draft of the Pact for the future, the draft version of Action 27 included this paragraph, which you can see on the screen. So here we actually do have a reference to the UN processes in which states have agreed to norms of responsible state behaviour in cyberspace, as well as mention of how the part in red there, that infrastructure needed for the delivery of essential public services and for the functioning of society must never be subject to malicious ICT activity. I mean, this was obviously contentious and it was removed from the final version of the Pact. There is debate around, I guess, what the norms of responsible state behaviour are, or in particular their legal status. Are they non-binding norms or legally binding obligations? As well as in this second part highlighted in red, this notion of critical infrastructure is, while it might seem objective, ultimately it is quite subjective in the sense that states can designate anything they want as critical infrastructure, so there's no sort of universal definition for that. This idea that such infrastructure must never be subject to malicious cyber activities, again, problematic. A lot of critical infrastructure is dual use, so it can be used for military and civilian purposes, whereas this is seems to be like a more a blanket ban. And then finally, this phrase, malicious ICT activity, also contentious. As I mentioned, some states regard cyber espionage, which is a form of malicious ICT activity, as unlawful, whereas others would see that as a violation of international law. So this paragraph, like I mentioned then, would have been proved to be too contentious, removed from the final version of the Pact. So just to conclude then, as I mentioned, the Pact I think is welcome in terms of emphasising the importance of the United Nations as an institution, especially at this time of crisis, and the importance of international law in this context, both in relation to autonomous weapon systems, nuclear weapons, and so on. But it is largely silent on the issues around international law and cybersecurity, and this idea of responsible state behaviour in cyberspace. So it doesn't mention them, and therefore doesn't really add any clarity to these ongoing debates. But as I mentioned, these UN processes that are ongoing are really important in terms of defining the boundaries of acceptable and unacceptable state behaviour in this context, and therefore providing predictability, stability, and minimising that risk of conflict escalation. Thank you.